I had spent weeks preparing for the dinner, checking every last detail with an obsessive attention that surprised even me. The silverware was polished to a mirror shine, the napkins folded into perfect swans, and the lighting adjusted to create that warm, intimate glow that makes everyone look their best. It wasn't just a family gathering. It was a moment I had carefully orchestrated, a performance where every prop and cue had meaning. My husband, Jack, believed we were simply having a private dinner with his side of the family to celebrate his mother's birthday. "It's so thoughtful of you to arrange all this, Emma," he had said that morning, kissing my cheek as I pretended to fuss over the final guest list. His eyes were bright with that boyish gratitude I'd fallen in love with 8 years ago. If only he knew. The truth was more personal, more deliberate. This dinner was my silent moment of triumph, a quiet unveiling of something I had built with my own hands while everyone else was busy underestimating me. My relationship with Margaret, my mother-in-law, had always been complicated, if complicated is the word for someone who has spent years trying to make you feel small. From the beginning, when Jack first brought me home to the pristine colonial on Beacon Hill, she had viewed me as a burden to her son's life. I was the woman from Dorchester, with a father who drove trucks and a mother who cleaned houses. In Margaret's eyes, I lacked the refinement and class that her Boston Brahmin family had cultivated for generations. Jack always had such interesting taste, she'd told her bridge club once, loud enough for me to hear from the kitchen where I was helping with dishes. I suppose there's something refreshing about simplicity. No matter how hard I tried to win her over, perfecting her family recipes, learning about wine, taking etiquette classes in secret, she always found new ways to dismiss me. The Christmas I spent days making her grandmother's plum pudding from scratch. She took one bite and asked if I'd considered using real vanilla next time. The engagement party where I wore my savings account on my back in the form of a designer dress, she simply asked if the store had a good return policy. But this night, I had no interest in impressing her. That game was over. I had already done something far greater than earn her approval. As I finished getting ready, I caught my reflection in the mirror. My auburn hair was swept into a simple updo, my makeup minimal but precise. The black dress I wore was elegant but not flashy, professional, chef-like even. I smiled at myself, feeling the confidence that comes not from being beautiful, but from being certain. The first guests arrived promptly at 7. Jack's sister Charlotte and her husband Dave were always punctual to a fault. Charlotte had inherited her mother's cutting tongue but none of her subtlety. "Well, you've certainly gone all out," she said, eyes sweeping critically over the private dining room. "What's the occasion? Finally pregnant?" She laughed as if this was the most delightful joke, knowing full well that our struggles with fertility were a source of pain. "Just celebrating family," I replied smoothly, taking their coats. Charlotte had always followed her mother's lead when it came to treating me, not outright hostile, but permanently unimpressed. The others filed in gradually, Jack's brother Michael and his wife, a few cousins, and an aunt and uncle who still referred to me as Jackie after 8 years of marriage. I greeted each one with warmth and grace, all while concealing the truth behind the evening's setting. The private dining room was intimate and beautiful, with exposed brick walls, dark wood tables, and hand-blown glass light fixtures that cast a warm, honeyed glow over everything. And then Margaret arrived, 15 minutes late as was her custom, just enough to make an entrance without seeming rude. At 68, she remained a commanding presence with her silver hair cut in an expensive bob, her posture rigid with old-money dignity, and eyes that missed nothing. Jack rushed to greet his mother with a kiss on the cheek while I stood back, watching as she took in the room. I watched her carefully, noting how she judged every plate, every glass, and every decoration. The slight purse of her lips told me the stemware wasn't to her liking. The quick arch of her eyebrow indicated she found the menu card stock insufficient. She ran a finger along the edge of her chair before sitting, as if checking for dust. "How quaint," she said, looking around the room. I wasn't aware this place had opened yet. I heard the chef was quite inexperienced. Jack gave me an apologetic glance. "Mom, Emma went to a lot of trouble to arrange this." Margaret smiled thinly. "I'm sure she did her best." I nodded graciously and signaled to the server to begin pouring the champagne, a small local brand that I knew would irritate her expectations for French luxury. She didn't know yet. None of them did. And that was precisely how I wanted it. As the appetizers were served, delicate local scallops with a brown butter sauce, I felt a strange calm settle over me. For years, I had let her words burrow under my skin, let her judgments define my worth. But tonight was different. Tonight, every snide comment and dismissive glance would come full circle. I caught the eye of the head server, Ryan, who gave me a subtle nod. Everything was ready. The stage was set. All I had to do now was wait for Margaret to play her part, which, if I knew her as well as I thought I did, wouldn't take long at all. Once everyone was seated and drinks were being poured, I watched as Margaret straightened in her chair, her fingertips lightly tapping against the stem of her champagne glass. She had that look in her eye, the one that preceded her most cutting remarks, a gleam of entitlement that had intimidated Boston socialites for decades. "Before we begin," she announced, her voice slicing through the pleasant chatter, "I'd like to make a toast." The conversation around the table hushed immediately. Margaret had that effect on people. They instinctively gave her the floor, as if her social standing demanded it. Jack smiled encouragingly at his mother, blissfully unaware of what was coming. I knew better. I had seen that specific smile too many times, thin-lipped and tight, the kind that never reached her eyes. Her voice, sharp and commanding, echoed through the room. "First, I want to thank everyone for coming to celebrate my birthday." A practiced pause. Family is everything, isn't it? Though perhaps some of us have different definitions of what constitutes appropriate family. Charlotte snickered softly while Michael looked down at his plate, embarrassed. I kept my expression neutral, though I felt my heart quickening. Without a second thought, Margaret raised her glass and addressed the room, not with gratitude, but with disdain. Her eyes locked on me, cold and calculating. And then she said it. "You know, Emma, I've been patient. I've watched you try to fit into a world that isn't yours. But the truth is, you are too poor to be here, too common. You always have been. Perhaps it's time to recognize that and leave now, before we all continue this charade." The room fell into a stunned silence. Forks paused midair, and heads turned, waiting for my reaction. Jack sat paralyzed, his face draining of color as he stared at his mother in horror. "Mom!" he finally managed, his voice strangled. "What are you saying?" But Margaret didn't look at her son. Her eyes remained fixed on me, a challenge glinting in them. I could feel my heart pounding against my ribs, but I kept my face calm. Inside, 1,000 memories flashed. Times she accidentally excluded me from family photos. Times she introduced me as Jack's friend at events. Times she asked if I wouldn't be more comfortable helping the caterers in the kitchen during holidays. The Christmas she'd given everyone monogrammed cashmere sweaters except me. I received a gift card to a department store with a whispered, "I wasn't sure what someone like you would want." The time she'd told Jack, not knowing I was in earshot, that he'd married beneath him and should consider whether he wanted to continue limiting his potential. Her words now felt like one last attempt to assert her control, to define me by my origins rather than my accomplishments. "Well?" Margaret pressed, her voice hardening when I didn't immediately crumble. "Nothing to say for yourself?" I could feel Jack beginning to rise beside me, ready to defend me, his face flushed with a rage I'd rarely seen. I placed a gentle hand on his arm, stopping him. This wasn't his battle. It never had been. I didn't flinch. I stood slowly, looking around the table at the faces that had judged me quietly for years. Charlotte's smug expression, Michael's averted gaze, the cousins who'd never bothered to learn my mother's name, the aunt who still, accidentally, sent holiday cards, addressed only to Jack. Then I glanced at the menu each guest had received that evening. Elegant, embossed with golden letters. And each one bore my surname, Donovan, something no one had noticed yet, too busy with their judgments and preconceptions to see what was right in front of them. This wasn't just a dinner. It was a carefully planned revelation. "Emma," Jack whispered, clearly worried I might make a scene. He'd spent years mediating between his mother and me, always caught in the middle, never fully standing on either side. I squeezed his hand gently. For the first time in our marriage, I didn't need him to defend me or make peace. I'd gone beyond needing protection from Margaret's barbs. "You know," I said, my voice soft but steady, "I've spent 8 years trying to be good enough for this family. 8 years of adjusting my accent, changing my clothes, hiding where I come from." Margaret's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes, a flicker of uncertainty. "I've listened to remarks about my background, watched as you've undermined me at every turn," I continued, meeting her gaze directly. "And all because my father worked with his hands, and my mother cleaned houses to put me through school. We all know why Jack married you," Margaret cut in, her voice sharp with disdain. "You trapped him with your charms, a convenient rebellion against his upbringing." I felt rather than saw Jack tense beside me, but I remained calm. "Is that what you think? That I seduced your son for his money? For access to your precious social circle?" I let out a small laugh, genuine in its disbelief. "Margaret, I never wanted your life. I never wanted your approval." Her eyes narrowed dangerously. "Then why are you here? Why continue this pretense?" "Because I love your son," I answered simply. "And because tonight I wanted you to see something." "See what?" she demanded, clearly growing uncomfortable with my composure. I reached for one of the menus from the table and held it up, my fingers tracing over the embossed lettering at the bottom, the detail everyone had overlooked. "Emma Donovan, executive chef and owner." "Tonight," I said, feeling a weight lifting from my shoulders. "I wanted you to see who I really am." With a calm voice and a quiet confidence that seemed to fill the room, I took one of the menus from the table and held it up. "Welcome," I said, "to my restaurant." A beat of silence passed before anyone reacted. Margaret's expression twisted, confusion quickly giving way to shock. I saw her eyes dart across the menu, then to the plaque near the entrance that had been there all along. "Emma Donovan, executive chef and owner," elegantly etched in brass. "What are you talking about?" Charlotte asked, her voice pitched higher than usual. She grabbed her own menu, scanning it with newfound interest. "Emerson's," I said, gesturing to the space around us. "Named after my grandfather. I own it. I'm the executive chef. This is my restaurant." Whispers filled the air as realization spread through the room. Michael let out a low whistle of surprise. This wasn't just a private dining room in some upscale venue in Back Bay. This was my restaurant, my dream brought to life after years of sacrifice and silent dedication. Jack stared at me, his expression a complex mixture of confusion, pride, and hurt. "Emma," he said quietly, "why didn't you tell me?" I met his eyes, seeing the question there, not just about the restaurant, but about all the secrets I'd kept. "I wanted to," I admitted. "But then I thought about all the times your mother said I'd never amount to anything. All the times she told you that marrying me was holding you back from greatness." I turned back to Margaret, whose face had gone pale. "You said I was too poor to be here, too common. But here is mine." The same place she had once said I'd never be able to open when Jack had casually mentioned my culinary school dreams. over a holiday dinner. Restaurants fail every day, she'd said with a dismissive wave. Especially those opened by people without connections. The same dream she had mocked for being childish and beneath her standards. You can't possibly. Be serious, Margaret finally said, her voice tight with disbelief. You're a caterer. You work birthday parties and office luncheons. I smiled. That was 3 years ago, Margaret. I catered to pay for culinary school. Then I worked 80-hour weeks as a line cook, then as a sous chef. For the past 18 months, I've been building this place, securing investors, designing the space, developing the menu. But Jack never said anything, Charlotte interjected, looking accusingly at her brother. Jack looked as stunned as the rest of them. I didn't know, he said softly, still processing this revelation. It was no accident that I had chosen this night, this moment, and this gathering for the reveal. I wanted them all to see not just who I was, but what I had become. And I wanted Margaret to see it most of all. Her words had always cut deep, but now they floated, weightless and powerless, in a room I had built on my own merit. You kept this from your husband? Margaret seized the opportunity, her voice dripping with judgment. What kind of marriage? The kind where one partner supports the other even when their dreams seem impossible, I interrupted calmly. Jack has always believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. He just didn't know how far I'd taken that belief. I turned to my husband, taking his hand. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. At first, I was afraid of failing, of proving your mother right. Then, when things started coming together, I wanted it to be a surprise. I wanted you to be proud. Jack squeezed my hand, his initial shock giving way to something warmer. I am proud, he said quietly. I just wish I could have helped. But the money, Margaret pressed, clearly searching for a hole in my story. Where did you get the capital? Surely Jack would have noticed. I have investors, I said simply. And my grandmother left me some money when she passed. Not enough for a place in Back Bay, of course, but enough to convince a few restaurant groups that I was worth the risk. I paused, unable to resist adding, and my credit is excellent, Margaret. Amazing what you can build when you've spent your life watching every penny. Ryan, my head server, approached the table with a bottle of champagne. Not the mid-range option I'd selected for the initial toast, but the special reserve I saved for true celebrations. Chef, he said with a respectful nod, should we proceed with the tasting menu as planned? The word chef hung in the air, confirmation of everything I'd just revealed. I nodded, feeling a surge of pride as he moved efficiently around the table, refilling glasses. You planned all this, Margaret said, her voice hollow with realization. You set me up to humiliate myself. I met her gaze directly. No, Margaret. I just gave you the space to be exactly who you are. What happened after that was entirely your choice. Dave, Charlotte's husband, who had always been kind to me in his quiet way, cleared his throat. I think it's bloody brilliant, he said, raising his newly filled glass. To Emma and Emerson's, may it be the first of many. A murmur of agreement rippled around the table as glasses were raised, some enthusiastically, others with reluctance. Margaret remained still, her glass untouched before her. The first course, I said, nodding to the kitchen staff who had been waiting for my signal, is a tribute to my childhood in Dorchester. My mother used to make fish chowder from whatever my father could bring home from the docks. This is a reimagined version, local haddock, smoked bacon, and sea beans. As the servers placed the elegant bowls before each guest, I watched Margaret's face. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely lost. The careful social mask she wore had slipped, revealing something vulnerable underneath. The realization, perhaps, that she had drastically misjudged not just me, but the entire situation. This is your moment. Jack whispered in my ear as he leaned close. Everything you've worked for. I nodded, feeling an unexpected lightness. It was my moment. But not because I had orchestrated Margaret's downfall. It was my moment because I had finally stepped fully into who I was, without apology, without shrinking myself to fit someone else's expectations. Shall we eat? I suggested to the table, picking up my spoon. Before it gets cold. The silence stretched into stillness as we began to eat. Some guests looked away, suddenly fascinated by the intricate patterns on their soup bowls. Others stared, at me as if seeing me for the first time. This woman they'd dismissed for years now revealed as someone with talents and ambitions they hadn't bothered to discover. Jack seemed caught between emotions, pride warring with hurt that I'd kept such a significant part of my life from him. Margaret, however, could not hide her humiliation. She slowly sat back down, her hands trembling slightly as she folded them in her lap. The soup before her remained untouched, steam rising and then dissipating into nothing, much like her authority over the evening. "The chowder is exquisite, Emma," Michael's wife Diane spoke up, breaking the uncomfortable silence. Diane had always been kinder than the rest, perhaps because she too had married into the family rather than being born into its rigid expectations. The smokiness with that hint of, "Is that tarragon?" I nodded, grateful for the lifeline. Yes, and a touch of preserved lemon to brighten it. Conversations cautiously resumed, though the usual family dynamics had been utterly disrupted. Charlotte, who typically dominated discussions with stories of her children's private school achievements, sat quietly, reassessing her perception of me with each spoonful of soup. Michael, who had always treated me with polite indifference, now looked at me with newfound respect, perhaps even a touch of embarrassment for his past dismissiveness. "How long have you been planning this place?" Dave asked, genuinely curious. He had always been the outsider among the Bradfords, a British academic who clearly found his wife's family's social preoccupations somewhat absurd. "The dream?" "Since I was a kid helping my grandmother in her kitchen," I replied, warming to the topic. "But this specific restaurant has been in the works for just over a year and a half. We opened softly last month, just to friends and family of the staff. Tonight is actually our first private event." "And you managed all this while maintaining your catering business?" Jack's Uncle Richard asked, impressed despite himself. I shook my head. "I closed the catering business when we secured the funding. I've been here every day since, working with contractors, training staff, developing the menu." Jack was watching me closely, a question in his eyes. We would have to talk later, really talk, about why I'd kept this hidden from him. But for now, he seemed content to let me have this moment. "The critics have already been remarkably positive," Ryan added as he cleared the soup bowls. "The Globe is running a feature next Sunday." I hadn't planned for Ryan to share that detail, but I didn't mind. The Boston Globe feature was the culmination of everything I'd worked toward. Recognition not as Jack Bradford's wife from the wrong side of town, but as Emma Donovan, chef and restaurateur. "I had no idea," Jack said softly, for my ears only. "All those late nights you said you were helping friends with events." "I was here," I confirmed, "building this. For us." Margaret pushed her untouched soup away, her composure gradually returning. "Well," she said, her voice tight but controlled, "it seems congratulations are in order, though I can't help but wonder about the wisdom of opening a restaurant in this economy. The failure rate is so high." I recognized the attempt to regain control, to reframe my success as a likely future failure. It was so predictable that I almost felt sorry for her. "The first quarter has exceeded projections," I replied evenly. "But you're right. The restaurant business is notoriously difficult. That's why I've made sure to learn every aspect of it from the ground up." The second course arrived, a salad of roasted beets with whipped goat cheese, candied walnuts, and micro herbs grown in our rooftop garden. The vibrant colors created a stunning presentation that elicited appreciative murmurs from around the table. "You should know, Margaret," I continued, "that everything served tonight comes from Massachusetts farms and fisheries, including the wine, which is from a small vineyard in the Berkshires." It was a detail I knew would irk her. Margaret believed nothing worth drinking came from American soil, let alone Massachusetts. Jack's cousin Melissa, who had remained quiet until now, suddenly laughed. "God, this is brilliant. All these years we thought Emma was just, She trailed off, perhaps realizing there was no polite way to finish that thought. "Just what?" I prompted, an edge to my voice. Melissa had the grace to look embarrassed. "Well, Jack's wife, the caterer. I was always more than that," I said quietly. "You just never bothered to ask." The weight of those words settled over the table. I didn't need to speak further. The room spoke for me. Every dish that was served, every wine poured, every carefully curated detail in the space bore my touch. Everything Margaret had just insulted was mine. Her attempt to humiliate me had turned into her own disgrace. The same people she expected to laugh along with her were now quietly distancing themselves from her. Throughout the next 2 courses, a delicate seared scallop with brown butter cauliflower puree, followed by a perfectly cooked rack of lamb with spring vegetables, the staff treated me with deference, calling me chef and owner in clear, deliberate tones. There was no hiding anymore. I had claimed my space, not with loud words or vengeance, but with presence and proof. This was my moment, and no one could take it from me. Margaret barely touched her food, though I noticed her, taking small, reluctant sips of the Massachusetts white wine, her expression suggesting surprised approval despite herself. Jack kept reaching for my hand under the table, squeezing it with a mixture of apology and pride. The rest of the family gradually relaxed, the initial shock giving way to genuine enjoyment of the meal. By dessert, a modern take on Boston cream, pie that honored tradition while adding my own twist, the conversation had shifted entirely. I was no longer the outsider they tolerated but couldn't quite place. I was the accomplished chef who had created this experience for them, whose restaurant would soon be featured in the Boston Globe. And Margaret? She sat at the head of the table, still commanding in her posture, but diminished somehow. The birthday we had ostensibly gathered to celebrate had been forgotten entirely, overshadowed by the revelation that the woman she had dismissed for nearly a decade had built something remarkable right under her nose. As coffee was served, I caught her watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not quite respect, not quite acceptance, but perhaps the beginning of a reassessment. It wasn't forgiveness I wanted from her, or even approval. It was simply recognition of who I truly was, not who she had decided I must be. And in that moment, in the stillness between courses in a restaurant that bore my family name, I finally had it. As the dinner continued and guests gradually adjusted to their new understanding of me, I found moments to slip away, checking in with the kitchen, making sure everything continued to run smoothly. In these brief escapes, I was revisiting every step that brought me here, a journey that none of these people, not even Jack, fully understood. I remembered my first job at 16, washing dishes at Malone's Diner in Dorchester, where my mother had worked as a waitress. The owner, Mr. Malone, caught me fixing a sauce that had broken when the cook stepped out for a cigarette. Instead of being angry, he moved me to prep work the next day. "You got good hands," he'd said. "Steady, smart." When Jack and I started dating my senior year at UMass Boston, I was already working nights at an Italian restaurant in the North End, learning pasta making from an elderly Sicilian woman who spoke little English but taught through gestures and taste. I'd come home, with flour in my hair and burn marks on my wrists, too tired to even shower sometimes. Jack found it charming then, his hard-working girlfriend from the real Boston, so different from the debutantes his mother kept introducing him to at charity galas. But after we married, when his family's expectations pressed in, I'd felt the subtle shift. The way he'd mentioned casually that now that we were settled, maybe I could pursue something more stable. The unspoken suggestion that catering was fine as a hobby, but not quite the career for Jack Bradford's wife. There had been times I had doubted myself, especially under Margaret's gaze. She always made me feel like I didn't belong, like success was reserved for others, for people who came from money, not struggle. The dinner party at their Beacon Hill home, where she'd asked me to help the actual caterer in the kitchen because you know how these things should go. The cutting edge, too, her voice when she introduced me to her friends. Emma was in the culinary arts before she married Jack. The worst had been 2 years ago at the family's summer home in Chatham. I'd mentioned my dream of opening a restaurant someday, and Margaret had laughed, not cruelly, which might have been easier to dismiss, but with genuine amusement, as if I'd said I wanted to fly to the moon. "Darling," she'd said, patting my hand in that condescending way. "Do you have any idea what that would take? The capital, the connections. Restaurants are passion projects for people who can afford to lose money. They're not for people who need to work." The memory still stung, but standing in the kitchen of Emerson's, watching my team execute the menu I'd spent months perfecting, the sting was fading. The sous chef caught my eye, raising an eyebrow in silent question. I nodded, letting him know everything was on track, both in the kitchen and with the family drama playing out in the private dining room. "They loving it, chef?" asked Thomas, my headline cook who'd followed me from my catering days, believing in my vision enough to take a pay cut when we first opened. "They're surprised," I replied with a small smile. "But yes, I think they're loving it." "Especially that lady who tried to throw you out of your own place?" he asked, a gleam of mischief in his eye. The kitchen staff had been briefed on the situation, not the personal details, but enough to know tonight was significant. "She's adjusting," I said diplomatically. Returning to the dining room, I caught Jack's eye. He smiled warmly, patting the seat beside him. I slid back into my chair just as Margaret was finishing what appeared to be a carefully recalibrated comment. "Impressive what young people can accomplish these days with social media marketing," she was saying. "So much easier to get the word out than in my day." I bit back a laugh. Of course she would find a way to attribute my success to some modern shortcut rather than years of grueling work. "Actually," I corrected gently, "we haven't done much social media yet. Our bookings have come through industry connections and word of mouth." "Industry connections," Charlotte echoed, puzzled. "But how would you have those?" The genuine confusion in her voice reminded me how little they knew of my life, how little they had bothered to learn. "I've been working in Boston restaurants for 12 years, I explained. "Since college. Many of my former colleagues are now chefs, managers, food writers. The restaurant world is smaller than you might think." I didn't mention the rejections from investors who couldn't see past my gender or my address, the bank loans denied, the 3 years of working double shifts, days at my catering business, nights in other people's restaurants to build my skills and reputation, the endless meetings with potential backers where I was asked if I planned to have children soon, as if my womb was a liability on a business plan. I didn't share how I'd had to scale back my original vision, settling for a smaller space than I'd dreamed of, fewer tables, a tighter menu, how I'd painted the walls myself to save money, recruited culinary school friends to help develop recipes for trade rather than pay, how I'd cried in my car after a particularly brutal rejection from a restaurant group, only to wipe away the tears and go straight to another pitch meeting. They didn't need to know about the nights I came home too exhausted to speak, how Jack assumed I was just tired from helping a friend with a wedding, rather than from negotiating with suppliers or training staff for my own establishment, how I'd practiced my pitch in the shower, refined my business plan during my morning commute, worked on menu costings while Jack thought I was browsing social media beside him in bed. This restaurant wasn't just a business. It was my answer. Not just to Margaret, but to every voice that told me I couldn't rise, To the careers counselor who suggested I consider more realistic goals when I mentioned culinary school. To the chef who said women didn't have the stamina for restaurant kitchens. To the loan officer who asked if my husband would be co-signing, his tone making it clear the answer should be yes. And now, those voices were silent, replaced by the clinking of glasses, the subdued admiration of guests who finally saw me for who I really was. "The dessert," Michael commented, scraping the last bit of Boston cream pie from his plate, "was extraordinary, not too sweet." "Thank you," I said. "It's my grandmother's recipe, but with a few modern touches. The sponge has brown butter in it, and there's a hint of coffee in the ganache." "Your grandmother was a chef too?" Margaret asked, the question seeming genuine for once. I shook my head. "No, she cleaned houses like my mom, but she cooked for our entire block. Sunday dinners, for anyone who wanted to come. She taught me that food is about bringing people together, not keeping them apart." The pointed comment hung in the air for a moment. Margaret didn't respond, but I saw something shift in her expression. Not quite remorse, but perhaps recognition. As Ryan began clearing dessert plates, Jack took my hand on top of the table this time, a public declaration of support that felt particularly meaningful after years of his careful neutrality. "I think," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the table, "we should have a proper toast. To Emma and to Emerson's. I might be the last to know about it." Here he shot me a look that was equal parts reproachful and loving, but I couldn't be prouder. Glasses were raised around the table. Even Margaret, after a moment's hesitation, lifted hers slightly. It wasn't acceptance, not really, but it was acknowledgement. And for tonight, that was enough. By the end of the night, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. What had begun as Margaret's birthday celebration had transformed into something else, entirely. A coming-out party of sorts, but not the kind the Bradfords were accustomed to. This wasn't about debutantes and society pages. It was about a woman claiming her space in a world that had tried to exclude her. As coffee and digestives were served, the conversation flowed more naturally than it ever had at a Bradford family gathering. For the first time, I was at the center rather than the periphery, fielding questions about the restaurant, my culinary philosophy, plans for the future. The family members who had previously overlooked me now sought my attention, as if proximity to my success might somehow rub off on them. Jack approached me quietly as I was explaining our locally sourced philosophy to his uncle. He waited patiently for a break in the conversation before pulling me gently aside. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice low. "Just for a minute." I nodded, leading him through the kitchen and into my small office at the back of the restaurant. It was nothing fancy, just a desk, 2 chairs, and walls covered in menu plans, food photographs, and supplier contacts. But it was mine, a space I'd carved out through sheer determination. Jack closed the door behind us and turned to face me. In the harsher light of the office, I could see the conflict in his eyes, pride warring with hurt, admiration with betrayal. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked simply. I sank into my desk chair, suddenly exhausted by the weight of the evening. At first, I wasn't sure it would work out. The failure rate for new restaurants is astronomical, especially in Boston. I didn't want to get your hopes up. And later, when it was clearly happening? His tone wasn't accusatory, just confused. I met his gaze directly. I wanted to prove I could do it on my own, without the Bradford name or connections. Understanding dawned on his face. Because of my mother. Not just her, I said, shaking my head. Though yes, I wanted to show her she was wrong about me. But it was more than that. I needed to know I could do this myself, even if that meant keeping me in the dark. There was hurt in his voice now. Emma, we're partners. At least I thought we were. The guilt I'd been suppressing for months surfaced, We are. And I'm sorry. I've spent so long being Jack's wife to your family, to our friends, even to myself sometimes. I needed something that was completely mine. I gestured to the space around us. But I was going to tell you tonight, after the dinner. I had it all planned. Just you and me, champagne in the empty restaurant. I was going to give you a key. Jack was quiet for a moment, processing. Then he laughed softly. You know, when you started coming home late smelling like different food every night, I actually wondered if you were having an affair with a chef. I couldn't help but smile. I guess I was, with this place. He crossed the room and knelt beside my chair, taking my hands in his. I'm proud of you, so incredibly proud. And I'm sorry if I ever made you feel like you needed to hide this from me. You didn't, I reassured him. This was my issue to work through, not yours. Still, he said, squeezing my hands. I should have seen it. Should have known you were capable of something this incredible. To be fair, I'm pretty good at keeping secrets, I admitted. Clearly, he said with a laugh. Any others I should know about? Are you secretly a spy too? An underground poker champion? I leaned forward and kissed him. No more secrets, I promise. When we returned to the dining room, the party was winding down. Charlotte and Dave were preparing to leave, with Michael and Diane not far behind. The aunts and uncles had already departed, leaving just Margaret sitting alone at the table, her posture as perfect as ever, despite the emotional tumult of the evening. Jack squeezed my hand before going to help his siblings gather their things. I hesitated, then approached Margaret. Thank you for coming, I said, the politeness ingrained after years of trying to navigate her sharp edges. She looked up at me, her expression unreadable. You did all this to humiliate me. I shook my head. No, Margaret. I did all this because I love food and wanted my own restaurant. Tonight was complicated, but it was never about humiliating you. Then why invite me here? Set me up to look foolish. You were invited because you're Jack's mother, and it was supposedly your birthday dinner, I replied evenly. What happened after wasn't planned, at least not the way it unfolded. She was quiet for a moment, studying me with new eyes. You're more calculating than I gave you credit for. Coming from Margaret, this was almost a compliment. I decided to take it as such. I prefer to think of it as determined, I countered. Something I suspect we have in common. A flicker of surprise crossed her face, followed by the faintest suggestion of respect. Not warmth, not acceptance, but recognition of a worthy opponent at last. The food was exceptional, she admitted reluctantly. Even the Massachusetts wine was palatable. From Margaret, this was high praise indeed. Thank you, I said simply. She gathered her handbag and stood. I suppose this changes things. It doesn't have to, I replied. I'm still the same person I've always been. You just know more about me now. Margaret regarded me thoughtfully. No, you're not the same. Or perhaps I simply never saw you clearly. Either way. She trailed off, adjusting her scarf with precise movements. Jack has made his choice. I should respect that. It wasn't an apology, not even close. But from a woman who had spent 8 years treating me as an interloper, it was a significant concession. He loves you, I reminded her gently. That hasn't changed either. Margaret nodded stiffly, then moved toward the door where Jack was waiting to escort her to her car. I watched them go, noting the tentative way she rested her hand on his arm, not the usual proprietary grip, but something more uncertain. As the rest of the staff closed up the restaurant, I walked through the quiet dining room, straightening chairs, checking that everything was in order for tomorrow. Ryan approached with 2 glasses of champagne. "For you and the boss," he said with a grin, nodding toward the door where Jack had just re-entered alone. I took the glasses with a smile of thanks. This wasn't how I'd planned to celebrate with my husband, after a dramatic family confrontation rather than in a peaceful, empty restaurant, but somehow it felt fitting. Jack crossed to meet me in the center of the room, taking his glass with a smile. "To the chef," he toasted. "To us," I corrected, clinking my glass against his. "And to no more secrets." "No more secrets," he agreed, his eyes warm with pride and love. As I locked up the restaurant that night, Jack waiting patiently by the door, I took one last look at the plaque with my name. Emma Donovan, executive chef and owner. Not just a title, a declaration. And with that, I smiled. Not for the triumph over Margaret, but for the woman I had become, despite everything. Or perhaps, in some strange way, because of it all. Every dismissal had fueled my determination. Every slight had strengthened my resolve. I hadn't set out to prove Margaret wrong, but in pursuing my own dreams with unwavering focus, I had done exactly that. Outside, the Boston night was cool and clear. Jack took my hand as we walked toward the car, our breath forming small clouds in the spring air. "So," he said, a playful note in his voice, "does this mean you'll be cooking dinner? At home more often now? Since you're a fancy chef and all?" I laughed, the sound carrying in the quiet street. "Not a chance. If anything, I'll be bringing home leftovers from the restaurant. Get used to eating a lot of whatever didn't sell that day." "I can live with that," he replied, pulling me closer against the chill. As we drove home through the sleeping city, I felt a sense of completion I hadn't expected. I had entered the evening prepared for battle, for a reckoning with Margaret that would finally level the playing field between us. What I hadn't anticipated was the feeling of freedom that came after, not just from her judgment, but from my own need for her approval. I had built something real and mine, and in doing so, had finally become fully myself. No longer Jack's wife from the wrong side of town, not the caterer playing at ambition, not the daughter-in-law perpetually falling, short of impossible standards. Just Emma, chef, owner, exactly where I was meant to be.